Welcome, Rob.
Thank you. Can you hear me? In 1974, 40 years ago, I attended an evening class in bookbinding at Camberwell Art School in South London. I had no intention of becoming a bookbinder, or for that matter, a paper conservator. I simply wanted to repair my modest collection of old books. It would be fair to say that Camberwell Art School in those days was a remarkable place. Not only was it at the forefront of the then modern conservation movement, but more significantly, it was largely staffed by craftsmen who had learnt their craft in a professional trade. This combination of modern conservation practice and traditional craft skills was a potent formula in the training of young book conservators and bookbinders in those days. Bernard Middleton, unquestionably England's most famous living bookbinder, told me recently that he thought bookbinding was like a disease. Once contracted, it is very difficult to eradicate from the system. I understand what he means because in no time I was hooked on the whole business. Back in the 1970s, I was working as a graphic designer in London and soon found myself smuggling old books into work with me to work on during my lunch hour. One day, quite by chance and without any forward planning, I wandered into a well-known bookshop in the heart of central London, still there incidentally, and announced quite full-heartedly that I restored old books. To my surprise and horror, the proprietor, Max Reed, handed me a box of rotting leather books and told me to get on with it. So for me, that's how it began. Not planned, but at least I could now be a bad book restorer rather than a bad paste-up artist. I continued to attend Camberwell, and I very quickly discovered the first universal truth about bookbinding. It is very, very difficult to do well. And with that realization, my admiration for those who could do it well only increased. In particular, the commercial fine binderies known in London as the West End trade. I scoured bookshops for examples of these bindings, and one day I took a recently purchased book of poetry which had been bound by arguably the greatest of all the West End binderies, Robert Riviere and Son. Eager to share my little treasure with my tutor, I was shocked by his negative response. He took one look at it and came out with the phrase that I was to hear repeated many times over the following years. "Oh," he said, "that's just a trade binding." He then proceeded to lecture me on all that was wrong with trade binding. The trade pared the leather too thinly. They used poor quality materials in order to cut costs. They slavishly followed the design styles of the past, and so on and so on. Instead, he told me, you should be learning about the arts and crafts movement and looking at the bindings of Cobden Sanderson and Douglas Cockerell. I had learnt my second important lesson about bookbinding, that there is a huge division between the commercial bookbinding sector and the non-trade sector. My tutor's opinions about the ills of 19th century commercial binding were not without foundation, and he was certainly right to draw my attention to the work of Thomas Cobden Sanderson and Douglas Cockerell. The latter in particular did more than anyone to bring modern practices into commercial binding. But I never lost my admiration for the great commercial workshops, particularly those firms known as the West End trade. So, I became a book restorer. I'm tempted to say to you, not a very good one, but that would perhaps be slightly too modest. I held my own and learnt a good living from the London antiquarian book trade. I think I was successful because my starting point was a love of old books, and I felt I understood the book trade's need to not over-restore, or for that matter, over-conserve, material that could only too easily be destroyed by an overzealous approach. Importantly, I survived, and in 1988 my business had reached a point where I was able to open my first shop in central London. And that was 1988, and it's pretty much exactly like that today. In preparing for this talk, I surprised myself by the extent to which, in those days, we concentrated on paper conservation. In those early years, we employed up to 10 people, of which half were paper conservators, the rest being book restorers. There we have an incredibly tidy-looking studio, taken, I think, probably 25 years ago, but it is pretty much the same today. I also remember the day I employed my first apprentice-trained binder. He arrived the day before. He was due to start work and laid his tools out on his bench. Well-sharpened knives, honed and shaped to his own particular techniques and methodology. The following morning he arrived early, read his newspaper till 8 a.m. and immediately started work, stopping only for his lunch and 2 tea breaks. When he left at the end of the day, there was a pile of beautifully bound books left under a leather-covered rate. Once again, his tools were laid out in a neat row ready for the next day's work. This pattern of work continued for many years until eventually this quiet, unassuming craftsman moved away from London to start his own business. His skills and self-discipline gained my unflinching admiration. So much so, I used to dream of one day running my own fine trade bindery. Well, as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. The business continued to grow, bolstered by a combination of good contracts with a number of institutions, most notably with the Clothworkers Company, an ancient livery company in the City of London, and a rich seam of work provided by the antiquarian book world. The decision to open a workshop in the centre of London was a powerful reason for our success in those days. To quote a well-known TV programme in England, it's location, location, location. One feature of the business in those days was the opening of a small shop at the front of the workshop to sell bookbinding and conservation materials. My initial reason for doing this was primarily to give us a greater variety and choice of materials in our own work. We also achieved retailers' discounts for our materials, thus making our work more cost-effective. It was also an aspect of the business which I absolutely loved, particularly sourcing and to some extent inventing new materials and equipment. Over the years, we developed our own ranges of handmade papers, decorative marble papers, pieces of equipment and tools too numerous to list. In truth, I spent far more time than was commercially viable on hunting down obscure pieces of equipment or materials that commanded a tiny market. Here lies one of the issues of the last 30 years. The decline of commercial bookbinding and the reduction of workshops, institutional and otherwise, has seen a massive reduction in the supply chain. Such items as good linen thread, solid dense millboard, even bookbinders' sewing needles are increasingly hard to find. And as the market for such items has contracted, the problem is only getting worse. I shall return to that subject a little later. My nagging obsession with fine trade binding persisted, and when the opportunity came along to buy 2 of the oldest and arguably the most famous London binderies, I went for the challenge. After 2.5 years negotiating with the parent company, the luxury goods retailer Asprey, we finally took over these grand old firms of Zanesdorf, founded in 1842, and Zangorski and Sutcliffe, founded in 1901. I don't think I ever felt so nervous as the day I went down to their old workshops in Bermondsey, accompanied by my lawyer, to announce we had just taken over the company. I have made some bad speeches in my life, but this one surpassed all previous efforts as I attempted to woo my 30 new employees that things were going to be a lot better now they were part of Shepherd's. All I remember was the silent air of total mistrust. Anyway, take them over we did, and a new era began which saw a fundamental shift in emphasis. Whereas before we were still the product of a Camberwell tradition with a broadly conservation approach to bookbinding and restoration, now we were running a bindery that had no regard or interest whatsoever in anything to do with such issues. In a way, this was strange, because during the late years of the 19th century, Joseph Zanesdorf had been concerned with conservation matters long before others had considered such things, and served along with Douglas Cockrell and others on the committee looking into the decay and preservation of leather. But by the late 20th century, this large survivor of the West End trade was simply concerned with selling newly bound books, fine bindings, to wealthy customers in London and New York. The bulk of our sales in those closing years of the 20th century was to Asprey, New York, with whom we had a contract to buy books, normally first editions of well-known works of literature and the arts, and rebind them lavishly. For the next 3 years, I would be flying backwards and forwards to New York in my newfound role as a bookseller. Just as I had never planned to be a bookbinder, I now found myself part of a new world of antiquarian booksellers. This change of direction brings me to another observation. I have now been a bookseller for over 15 years, and I can fairly say I know many of the top booksellers in both London and New York. I've also served for the last 4 years on the Antiquarian Book Association Council, most recently as treasurer, and spend much of my time with that fascinating crowd of eccentrics known as the antiquarian book trade. But interestingly, I cannot recall a single occasion when the subject of book conservation ever came up on the agenda or in any general discussion. The rare book world are, of course, obsessed with original condition. And as you might therefore suppose, the conservators and book collectors share a common interest with a non-interventionist approach. But I don't believe that is the case. For example, the sale of modern first editions is dominated now by the desirability of what are described as unrestored dust jackets, which in turn are often wrapped up in cheap plastic covers. It's not that the antiquarian booksellers are not interested in conservation and preserving their books, quite the contrary, but there is a curious disconnect in their attitude to thinking about or discussing the subject. Everyone is aware of the phrase acid-free, and acid of course means harmful, but it is all true that many booksellers and manuscript dealers also use the wonderful melanet sleeves in the knowledge and hope they are better than using the plastic sleeves that they might buy in the high street stationers. I suspect that melanet's popularity, however, has more to do with the fact that it makes the items look better. And that is about as far as it goes. I wouldn't go as far as to say that dealers don't care. I'm sure they do care. But I don't think conservation issues keep them awake at night. It has been our privilege to work for many serious collectors over the years, but their major concerns are less to do with the acidic paper or rotting leather, and more to do with not anything that may affect the integrity and therefore the value of the item. The trend, of course, now is to put everything into boxes. On the whole, rebinding has become anathema to both the antiquarian book world and their clients, which is a problem when you run a company like mine. This wasn't true, however, of the fashionable clientele of Madison and Park Avenue, and our trade with New York continued to flourish until the terrorist attacks of September 11th that changed the face of the American psyche forever. The demise of Lehman Brothers followed up, and the financial crash brought the American trade to an eventual halt. It was a difficult period for our company, and it was time to look at who we were as a business. If we were to keep fine binding alive, then we had to find new ways of generating business. Many years earlier, following the Wall Street crash in 1929, Zangorski and Sutcliffe had also lost the majority of their trade with the USA. George Sutcliffe had to find new ways of generating business. When he died in 1943, having run the company for 42 years, it was his ability to adapt to changing times that had kept the business alive. Zangorski and Sutcliffe was a truly remarkable company. Zanesdorf might have been one of the biggest and grandest of the West End trade binderies. I'll show you a picture of it. There it is. That building is still there today, just off Shaftesbury Avenue, if you are familiar with London. And employing at the height of their powers over 100 people. But Zangorski and Sutcliffe, protégés of Cobden Sanderson and the arts and crafts movement, were touched with pure stardust. That's Francis Zangorski on the left, and George Sutcliffe on the right. Their teacher at the Central School of Art was no less a figure than Douglas Cochrane. Set them on a path that was to create one of the greatest, if not the greatest, bindery of the early 20th century. And if you don't believe me, just look at the following pictures. Here they are at the start of this picture was taken, we think, about 1903 in their first workshop. And within no time at all, they were producing the most exquisite gold-tooled bindings, as you might see here. This particular binding here is in the Henry Huntington Museum in Pasadena, and I urge any of you, whoever finds themselves in that part of California, to go and look at this binding. It's kept in the stacks, it's not on public display. You will get no idea from this picture of just how exquisite and detailed and beautiful the gold tooling on this book is. Yes, the design may not be to your taste, but the craftsmanship is unsurpassed. For the next 10 years, they produced, it is estimated, over 150 bindings of this kind of quality. Here's another one in the Frankfurt Museum, the Frankfurt Stadt Museum, where it has been since 1905, again hidden away in the stacks. This little group of bindings just shows you how good they really were. These weren't exhibition bindings. These were bindings that were given away to the lady members of their best clients. That's the lady relatives of their best clients, in this case, mags, the booksellers. Every year, they would be given a little binding. There'd be a few jewels thrown into each binding, just for good measure. The quality of these bindings, incidentally, they're going on exhibit in mags this week. There's a complete run of them, 54 years of Christmas bindings, all of whom were given away as presents. It just proves what a remarkable level of craftsmanship these guys were working at. And here, of course, is one binding you may have heard of, not least because this was the book that went down on the Titanic. Now, you may wonder why we have a colour photograph of a book that went down on the Titanic. The answer to that is it's a digital recreation. We have the original black and white photograph, but I employed a computer artist to fill in the colours. Anyway, that one's on the Titanic, but that one is in the Wormsley Library in Oxfordshire, and again, it is the most exquisitely bound book you'll ever see. Francis Zangorski unfortunately died in 1912 in a bathing accident, and it was now left to George Sutcliffe. Here he is in the 1920s. I chose to show you this photograph because, as you can see, he has reverted somewhat to the arts and crafts style, if you're familiar with arts and crafts style bindings, to his formative years. In his right hand, in his left hand, he is holding an Ashendene dispenser. And in his right hand, you can probably just make out he's holding a miniature book, probably one of the miniature books that were made for Queen Mary's Doll's House. I particularly like this picture because just up there at the top is a picture of his late partner, Francis Zangorski. There's the workshop in 1923. That's the finishing shot. Look how smartly dressed they are. What pride. Craftsmen. Craftsmen who'd done long apprenticeships to get to this level of expertise. And here they are again in 1947. They had survived 2 world wars and much hardship, and when they assembled on the roof of their Poland Street bindery in 1947, you could see some of the greatest craftsmen of their generation. These modest men and women represented a vanishing world. The role of the traditional craftsman was changing, and the next half of the 20th century saw the closure of almost all the remaining fine craft binderies in England. For those of you who know Bernard Milton, that's his dad. Regent Milton, whoops. We know that, incidentally, we now know the names of all those craftsmen, bar one lady at the front. Now, it was our mission when we took over the company in 1988 to keep traditional fine binding alive. It wasn't just a case of maintaining a market, it was also a crisis of training. When I started my bindery in 1988, it was relatively easy to recruit young craftsmen from the colleges. My present bindery director, Alison Strachan, came straight out of London College of Printing. Dan Ray, my conservation director, went to Camberwell, and so on. By the end of the century, all those college courses were gone and had been replaced by book arts courses. Something went terribly wrong with vocational education during those years. Camberwell no longer taught the practical skills that we needed in a commercial workshop, and it was quite possible to obtain a degree in book arts at the London College of Printing without ever actually binding a book. It was against this background that we started our own training programs, and for the last 2 years we have been working with the largest UK vocational body, City and Guilds, to rewrite the bookbinding syllabus. We now offer City and Guild certificates and awards in a new Level 1 and Level 2 qualification in bookbinding. We also have a newly formed training facility in the English countryside in Wiltshire. There it is. We call it this is our Daffodil Barn. It's actually a huge barn which we now have almost entirely given over to training, and we run courses there for injured servicemen as well as part of their recovery. In 2003, we took the decision to buy another ailing business, the paper retailing business known as Faulkner Fine Papers. Those of you who have visited London over the years may well have known it. Yes, we've moved, by the way, if you do know. Like them, we had always sold bookbinding materials, and here was our opportunity to grow our materials business. Faulkner's had always specialised in selling Japanese papers, and it was about this time I met for the first time the redoubtable Nancy Jacoby of the Japanese paper place. Are some of you aware of the Japanese? Yes, good. There she is on the left. Nancy is an absolute enthusiast for everything to do with Japanese paper. And she persuaded me, actually I didn't need much persuading, to travel to Japan and see for myself how Japanese paper is made and meet some of the really specialist paper makers that she has supported commercially through the Canadian business. And here we are visiting one such paper maker. Many of the best Japanese papers are made in very small workshops, in often very remote places, and they are very fragile businesses. Just like the craft bookbinding industry, they hang on by a thread, usually more to do with enthusiasm than commercial viability. And Nancy has made it her business to support them commercially by publicising what they do and by promoting their papers, which are often quite a lot more expensive, through her amazing business in Canada and North America. As I said, she's a very persuasive lady, is Nancy, and I had little choice, even though I didn't mind, in helping her promote those papers through our retail business. I also learned on that trip another thing. I learned, for example, that just because a paper has a Japanese name, it doesn't mean it's a high-grade paper. There's plenty of, for example, Cozy She, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is a common repair paper used in book restoration. But quite a number of Cozy She manufacturers are using a high percentage of sulfite wood pulp in their manufacture. So one has to also take into account, and of course now there are many imitators in the Far East of Japanese paper, and many of those papers are not very high grade at all. So one has to be very careful, and I would urge you to look at the Japanese Paper Place website and follow Nancy Jacoby's crusade really to keep the best Japanese paper not only being made but being imported into Western workshops. With Nancy's encouragement and support, we do as much as we can to promote the best quality Japanese papers. And this is our new store just behind Victoria Station in London. But as the market declines, the truth is there is less and less demand for these products, and for all conservation and bookbinding materials generally. The shrinking of institutional workshops, the non-interventionist approach, the similar approach by the commercial antiquarian book trade, has all meant that there's less and less actual physical bench work going on. So this is a problem, not only, as I say, for running a workshop, but it's also a problem for trying to supply the best materials. We do what we can in our new store to promote as many decorative papers, any types of papers that we can. We carry over 3,000 different types of paper in there, and we will always promote any small maker that we come across. It also gives us, I say, the opportunity to do our own thing, and for example, and I brought along a few sheets of this, we always felt there was a need for a conservationally sound paper that could be used when replacing end papers on 19th century and actually first half of the 20th century books, which generally have acidic, rather brown, dull-looking end papers. When we needed to replace them, there was no good equivalent. There were some beautiful handmade papers, but they looked too good. They didn't really match. So we asked a small mill up in North London if they would produce for us a paper that represented those acidic, as I say, rather sort of slightly brown, slightly grey papers that you find so often when you're working as a book restorer or you're having to rebind old books. And they came up with this. Now, we could never have afforded to have had a ton of paper made if we didn't have our retailing side of the business. Because we also sell this to our bookbinders, we are able to have a project like this go forward where we can produce paper that we can use in our bindery. Actually, curiously, one of the biggest markets we found for this paper is the film props world, who are buying it, I'm pleased to say, in quite large quantities, because they never buy anything in small quantities, which is fantastic news for us. So that's pretty much our business. Oh yes, and then we also do what we can to run seminars in our shop in the evenings. This is David Lanning, for example, some of you may know from the leather tanners Hewitt's, who produce the most wonderful vegetable tanned calf skin. He comes along, do many other people like him in the evenings, and we have short seminars in the shop. We usually give everybody a glass of wine, which encourages them to come and stay. And we have a generally informal conversation about whatever issues come up. These are great fun, and it's a way of bringing everybody together who have a common purpose. And it's a great privilege for us to be able to do these things in our lovely new shop. I will just finish by giving you a small example of the other side of our business, because as I said, we had to reinvent ourselves, and we reinvented ourselves by becoming booksellers. We now use the bindery, our own bindery, to produce books for us. These can take many different forms. This is our shop in Mayfair where we sell books. That is the interior. And as you can see, we're not like a conventional rare book shop. We have one large shelf against the wall where we display things as beautifully as we can. We like to think that they're somewhere between a bookshop and an art gallery, if you like. Our work covers a lot of different areas. Here, for example, is the centenary edition of the Ian Fleming novels, all 14 James Bond books. This set is 18 volumes in all, including his other works. Every single book has a designed onlay binding on it. Diamonds Are Forever has a real diamond set into the spine. And the set sells for £14,000, which is a lot of money. So far, out of the 54 available sets, we've sold 50. Not all personally ourselves. I think we personally sold around about 16 sets. That's a great project for a bindery like ours because it keeps everybody very busy. Here again is a typical example of the kind of books that we bind for ourselves. 3 books there, very different. Pelé, who knows the footballer, that happens to be a signed copy. It's not a rare book, but it's a very desirable book. It's a very desirable present. And at this level of binding, what we're really selling are gifts. We're selling books that have been bound as beautifully as we can. Usually they are bought as gifts for people. There's the book in the middle, you will know Karen Blixen's Out of Africa, made into a very famous film. That is a first edition of the book that we will have bought probably with its having lost its original binding. Therefore we feel ethically absolutely fine about rebinding it. And the top book, well, that's Summer Cooking, that's Elizabeth David's classic. again, it's a gift. The price ranges of our fine bindings go anywhere from, say, £500 to £10,000. And often that price is largely determined by the value of the book inside. For example, if we rebind a Casino Royale in a dust jacket, that's worth £20,000 to £30,000 these days. If I buy a copy of Casino Royale without a dust jacket, I can probably pick one up for £2,000 or £3,000. I can put a binding on it, perhaps at the cost of another £1,000, and sell it for £5,000 or £6,000. That's the economy. That's how the economy works. Now, I did mention the non-interventionist approach, and we make boxes. We probably make more boxes than we make bindings these days. Inside this box for Dracula is a first edition, another £10,000 book. That, incidentally, is white calf inlaid over black Morocco goatskin with platinum lettering on the spine. Another one, Lady Chatterley's Lover. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about that book. Again, it's a box, it's not a book. These pictures, incidentally, were taken for publicity shots. And there is the Larson trilogy. That is, in fact, the publisher's copy with the special letter of rejection inside that Larson received before he died, I believe, which was sold at Sotheby's for, I think, £11,000. So we do get to work on some extremely interesting projects. Some of them are our own designs, some of them are with designers. We don't mind. The main thing is that we're working at the top level we can work. And there I'm going to end with a picture of us today. That is our, well, it was actually, that picture doesn't include me because it was taken as a gift for me when I was turned 60. And they all assembled, and so as I couldn't forget who they were. That also includes our retail staff, because the point here at Shepherd's is that we don't differentiate between anybody in the company. Everybody works together, everybody has an input into the business. The retail staff are as concerned with our binding business as our binding business is concerned with the materials we sell. Everybody's an enthusiast. And the point I was mentioning to Jeff earlier about getting the opportunity to exhibit as a company rather than as an individual is a potent one for me, because although 4 or 5 of those people in that photograph, Eri Funizaki standing at the front there, are well-known individual binders in their own right. When we work together as a team, which is what we'll prefer to do, we can't exhibit, not in England. There is no way there's no format for it other than through our own shop. That, I'm not particularly happy about that, but the thing I really don't like about it is the fact that the designer bookbinding movement, for all its good things, has led young bookbinders to believe that what they are trying to do, or what they should do, is become artists. And that every part of the process has to be done by one individual and them alone. And I think that's quite wrong. I think it would be so much more healthy if people worked together, and once again people chose to specialise in what is an incredibly difficult individual aspect of the business. I mean, for example, we have a lady there at the front, and she does the most exquisite headbands you'll ever see. 3 or 4 or 5 core headbands. I don't know anybody else who can do that. The gold finishers, as I already mentioned, did 5-year apprenticeships to get to their level of expertise. For me, and you really don't see great gold finishing anymore because nobody has the time to be able to specialise in it. I think it's a mistake, and I would much rather see groups of bookbinders getting together and working as teams and putting individual skills together as they did in the days of old. Now, Zangorski and Sutcliffe, they worked as a team, and they exhibited many times before the Second World War. They never exhibited again after the Second World War. They were protégés of the arts and crafts movement. They were created by the arts and crafts movement, but the arts and crafts movement, as it changed during the course of the 20th century, focused almost entirely on this notion of the individual. So the very process that created the company in the end led to the demise of many of the craft binderies. So if I have one statement to you all, I believe that the way forward now for fine binding, and indeed for the allied disciplines of conservation and restoration, is for people to once again realise that bookbinding is not an isolated craft. It's not even isolated from the rest of the things that go to make a book. I mean, Douglas Cockrell said in 1929, bookbinding is not an isolated craft. The printers, the paper makers, the leather tanners, the typographers, the authors, everybody plays a part in it. So why should bookbinding be any different? So that, anyway, is how we view the world from Shepherd's Bookbinders. We are one, most of the time, happy team, who, I can't say that we don't have issues, of course every company does, but we do strive towards one goal, and it's a very coherent feeling within the company. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Some comments or some questions? We have seen really amazing examples of artistic and woodstory bindings and materials. Yeah, we would be happy to have such shops in some fields. Maybe in the future we can open one. Some questions? I think it was a good retrospection of the history of binding as well, and the movement of binding, of binders. Okay, Gor?
I was wondering, you are offering courses. That's one of your core things you do. The people who attend these courses, what are their intentions? Are they going to be professional builders, bookbinders? And if so, is there a market for it?
Well, I mean, the short answer is it's a very, very broad range of people. It really varies from quite a number of people who have different lives, different professions, but have always loved books. But it also includes younger people who have perhaps done arts degrees or sometimes practical arts degrees, fine arts, or indeed studied literature at university. It's very broad. The degree to which people see themselves as being able to earn a living from bookbinding is equally broad. Many people believe they're going to be book artists. I think that's a very hard road to go down. A number of others, not as enough as I'd like to see, would like to join firms like ours or become book restorers. But it is a shrinking market. One has to be realistic. So, I don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I have a question. What are many of your students? I mean, they're young people or professionals who like to change their occupation, or what is the profile of your students of your workshops?
I think you do get quite a number of people who are having a midlife, making a midlife decision. I won't use the word crisis. Because I think it's quite common these days for people not to do the same thing for their whole career. And bookbinding is a very attractive alternative if you've spent your life, well indeed, we're training ex-army people who find it a wonderful change of pace to having been in the British Armed Forces.
Yeah, because one of our aims of our project is to offer some training materials for people who like really to change their profession and to initiate some own business, to become entrepreneurs and start something in the field of binding or artistic materials selling or such things. And this is, I think, a good area to find some work and some possibilities.
Well, I would just add that we're also started the process of putting all our courses online on our website for everybody to either follow on the website or download the notes as a PDF. Our aim is to make every piece of knowledge we have available free to everybody we can via the internet. It's in all our interests to do so, I believe.
Thank you. Just a brief comment there. Your last statement, of course, is extremely significant, because the traditional view, particularly in France and in other countries, was that you kept everything very close by. And I can remember in my younger days working with an edge gilder in Bath, and he would say, oh yeah, bring along some books, bring along half a dozen if you can. And he would say, how do you want them done? And I would say, well, I'd like all the edges gilt, you know. I said, when can you get them done? He said, oh, well, by the end of the day. Which I couldn't believe. When I went into his workshop, he was then set up on his own. He had worked for a very large firm similar to Zangossi and Sutcliffe and Jainsdorf. And it was a wall, we're running with damp and everything else, hopeless situation. They were absolutely perfect. But he wouldn't tell anybody how he did it. And when he was working for this particular big firm, if somebody walked by, he would throw a cloth which he had handy over the edge that he was gilding, because he didn't want anybody to know.
Yeah.
So this whole idea, which in fact is a very good one and very English and in general, the openness of allowing people the opportunity to see how you do things and to discuss it, because the continental, which of course I'm also part of, you know, that tradition is not a strong one at all.
In the Netherlands.
Well, in the Netherlands and elsewhere, you know, people tend, he's after my job, they would say. And that still continues in some places. The second thing to point out is that, and I quite agree with you in most of these things, is that the institutional need for recognition at an honours degree level means that any subjects which involve bench work and practice, that part suffers. There was a very good, for example in Amsterdam, a very good middle road course to do with restoration, Institute for Restoration and so on. But now it's part of the University of Amsterdam, and the individuals studying it are all very talented and highly intellectual and can read and write, etc. But the amount of practical work they do is very limited. So to achieve this balance between hands, heart, and mind, and knowledge, of course, is a very difficult thing, which is causing problems and will cause problems for the younger folk. I shan't live to see it.
Well, it's already caused problems. We haven't been able to recruit from a college for at least 10 years.
Okay, thank you.